Hello, I'm Merve Tahiroğlu, the Turkey Program Coordinator at POMED. There's been a huge controversy in recent weeks concerning Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu. During a visit to Uruguay last month, Çavuşoğlu was caught on camera responding to Armenian protesters against his government by making a hand sign that is associated with a far-right ethno-supremacist movement in Turkey called the Grey Wolves. Here's the video. To discuss what this sign means, who the Grey Wolves are, and what the foreign minister's gesture means to ethnic and religious minorities in Turkey, I'm here with two great scholars today, Ohannes Kılıçdağı, who is a Turkish-Armenian historian, and Dilan Okçuoğlu, a Kurdish political scientist from Turkey. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
So Ohannes, let me start with you. Who are these Grey Wolves, and what does this hand gesture mean to Turkey's Armenian citizens, both historically and today?
Yeah, I mean, the history of Grey Wolves and the political movements they take place has a long history. But basically, it's, as you say, it's a Turkish racist far-right group. And I think I can tell they are a sort of paramilitary organization of Nationalist Action Party. Both, I mean, the party and these Grey Wolves, or in Turkish they say Ülke Ocakları, were founded in late 1960s. And actually, they have been involved in political violence, various assassinations since then, especially in 1970s, when Turkey was deep in this political violence. And they also have, some criminal mafioso relations also in Turkey. They were also engaged in this kind of activities. However, maybe as a telling indicator of Turkish politics and Turkish political culture, on the paper they are a legal organization. They are not an underground organization, or they are not a banned organization in Turkey. And on the contrary, I may say that in the eyes of large masses, this organization is prestigious. I mean, leaving aside being criminal or illegal, so they have a certain prestige. And that hand gesture or hand sign is a symbol of this Grey Wolves and Nationalist Action Party. But again, as an indicator of Turkish political culture, this hand sign is not limited or restricted to this movement and organization. As a matter of fact, Çavuşoğlu is not a member of Nationalist Action Party or a member of Grey Wolves organization, but he, beside others, he already internalized that gesture and that ideology, okay? So being a symbol of these Grey Wolves, what I'm trying to say is that it has also a cultural meaning and annotation, a cultural reference, political cultural reference, this gesture. Of course, referring to this far-right Turkism, racism, etc., all that bundle of values, let's say. As for your question, what it means for Armenians, it's difficult, I think, understand, emotionally difficult to understand, to express, because undoubtedly it's a heavy emotional burden, okay? Because you have to tolerate someone mocking your, I would say, eternal grief, okay? You have a grief which is already cannot be fixed. It's already there for more than a century, and suddenly, I always say suddenly, but it's not surprise, by the way, someone mocking, stepping on it, on your grief. So it's a kind of, if you like, you feel helpless, okay, in the face of this gesture, in the face of this gesture by, I would say, perpetrator. Because I think this situation or this psychology is a clear continuation of genocide, I think, and clear continuation of victimization. This kind of gestures, even, I mean, stepping on your grief, stepping on your pain, even I would say spitting on your face, is a clear insult, and it's a very difficult to cope with emotionally. And you feel that the shadow of perpetrators still haunts you, even after one longer than a century. And you feel that risk of annihilation still exists, because there are many people, some of them at the top of politics, which or who praise the genocide, praise the perpetrators, leaving aside facing the genocide. And it makes you think that they may repeat it if they find suitable conditions, suitable political conditions under their hand. So to repeat myself, it creates a sense of helplessness and a sense of, again, risk and threat as you see that gesture. And you know, indeed that gesture, I think, also an expression of a will, an expression of a psychology by Çavuşoğlu and others. So again, I would say it's a sign of, again, a risk and threat. This is how I perceive that gesture. And you know, not only the gesture, but if you see, I mean, watch the video showing the Çavuşoğlu, you will see the attitude of Çavuşoğlu's attitude. How you know, shameless, I would say, how shameless he acts. You know, you are a politician. You can visit many different countries. And not only for Turkish politicians, this is true, of course, all politicians. You can face protesters. This is a very, I would say, natural part or the normal part of being a politician traveling around the world. What would you do at most? To turn your hat and ignore them. But Çavuşoğlu preferred, as I say, to push their pain, to push their grief. This is very telling, I think, about the general attitude, general psychology in Turkish politics.
That was a great explanation. Thank you. You really showed us the fear, this kind of, you know, coming from a top official, the fear it inflicts on people. And it's not just the Armenians, right? You would say it's other all religious minorities, you know, including Greek citizens, Alevi citizens, would feel, the Jewish citizens of Turkey.
You know, even more than that, because, you know, today the ratio of Christians and Jews, leaving Alevis aside, the ratio of these Christians and Jews is less than 0.1%. So this doesn't mean that they are not under threat or the threat they face is not important. But what I'm trying to say is that this attitude praising genocides or whatever mass violence perpetrators could find other victims and other targets. They don't have to be Armenians, Greeks, Jews, or whatever. For example, yes, Alevis is a good example in that sense. Or nowadays, immigrants or refugees, however you define them. So as long as you do not face these values, mass violence in politics, that culture or that attitude may and will find other targets. That's the real risk here. That's the real, I think, threat here.
Well, I'll bring it to Dilan with that remark. Dilan, of course, the Kurds are Turkey's biggest ethnic minority, and they also have very strong feelings about this movement and this sign and this ideology that we've been talking about. So I want to ask you, I mean, what do the gray wolves mean to the Kurds in Turkey, and how does it make them feel to see a top government official, a civil servant like this, use such a sign?
Okay, thank you, Merve, first for this vibrant discussion on such a timely topic. Actually, let me briefly start with what Ohannes have already mentioned. I will just have minor remarks. I would like to add on the history that he briefly mentioned at the beginning of his comments, because I would like to mention the term Turkism and Pan-Turanism, which I still believe have a huge legacy on the rise of AKP. Even if the first years of AKP was promoted more like pro-European Unionist, progressive, pro-Western party, that's one of the main reasons why the party got so much support, even from some ethnic and religious minority groups. If we look at the party personnel, party cadres, and the ideology of the party, the components that make the party itself and give shape to its kind of current identity, we can see that Pan-Turkism has this kind of influence. What do I exactly mean by that? Actually, Pan-Turkism, because that sign is widely used by the members of MHP, a Nationalist Action Party. However, there is now kind of overlap between those who support AKP and MHP. And especially after the return of violence and the failure of peace process, quote unquote, let's say since 2015, and all the major developments that have happened since then up until now, including the imprisonment of Selahattin Demirtas, including of course, imprisonment of Osman Kavala, and charging both influential thinkers or leaders for supporting quote-unquote terrorism, and also academic crackdown, which ended up jailing people or confiscating their passports, or putting some of them in jail and pushing them actually leave the country. So all these developments actually have already shown us that the ideology of AKP is not too far from Pan-Turkism. And I can give more examples, and especially maybe in the second round, we can have, we can talk a little bit more about this too, if we have questions or comments. But we have to remember that also Pan-Turkism is kind of a subcategory of Pan-Turanism. And Pan-Turanism extends beyond the boundaries, the borders of Turkey. And that's also embraced by some people living in Hungary or Estonia, and from that area, from that region of the world, even to the Pacific, right? So this ideology is influenced by Nazism in the 1930s. And when you look at the history of the movement, you see that it was more secular and, of course, racist at the beginning, when it was initially influenced by Nazism. But its emergence goes back to the late 90s and early 20th century. However, when Alparslan Türkeş established MHP in 1969, we see that he clearly says that he's influenced by Pan-Turanism. That's why he was even sued for that. He was in trial for that, for supporting Pan-Turanism. However, he also changed the character of that ideology from a more secular point towards Islamism. So he aimed, from the beginning, he aimed to reconcile Islamist values with pan-Turkish ideals. Why is it important? Why am I talking about this? Because it has a clear legacy on the experiences of ethnic and religious minorities in Turkey. Given the fact that Turkish and his supporters and everyone who was influenced by that ideology and by that political movement, which is not only one party. That's why I'm trying to underline that fact, actually. It's a movement, it's ideology, it is state-led ideology. That's why it is also paramilitary, as Ohannes said. That is why it is extra legal, extra judicial dimension. And that's why we have to talk more about JITEM, Gendarmerie Intelligence Organization or Unit, which was denied by the state itself for years and years, because that organization was used by the state to kill dissidents, let's say Kurdish dissidents, Kurdish intellectuals, Kurdish journalists, businessmen, lawyers, including, of course, Armenians. We don't still know who directly killed or who killed Hrant Dink. Like we know Ogün Samast, but we also know that he's the guy who's used by some people within the deep state organization, but we don't know who these people are still, because they're not put in prison, they're not even put in trial. And the same thing is happening to Garap Aylan these days, who is a member of parliament from HDP. And Garap Aylan is directly threatened after Meral Akşener, who is another Turkish nationalist. And again, she comes from that kind of the same darkness, actually. If you look at her political career, there are lots of episodes in her life that tell us that she comes from that kind of dark background, we would say. So to wrap it up, I know that I mentioned a couple different things, but I would like to merge all of this. So Alparslan Türkeş brought Islamism back, but he did something extra. He reconciled Islamism with Turkic values, ideals, which is a bigger threat for Kurds, for Alevis, for Armenians, for leftists, progressives, because Türkeş and all his followers see these groups as the biggest threat to Turks, to Turkism, to Turkish state. So that's why these threats, quote unquote, should be eliminated, quote unquote, right? They should be controlled, they should be expelled, they should be killed, they should be silenced. So that is why Çavuşoğlu, I think does this intentionally for a couple different reasons. But if you look at his social media accounts in the last couple of years, every April 4, by the way, he commemorates Alparslan Türkeş's death, like anniversary, whatever. So he pays his respect to Alparslan Türkeş openly. So we can say that this is what populism would do, because populism is one of the definitive characters, features of AKP, the current government. That's why they will keep sending confusing and mixed messages to different groups, especially when the election is approaching, right? But I don't think that this is the only motivation. I think they really, especially after they, have this kind of coalition with MHP, in many sense, they don't even hide that Turkish identity is something that every citizen of Turkey should appeal to. So they do not even think that there's any check and balance mechanism that would stop them from doing that. There's no opposition for them. Even if there's opposition, it's not functional. So yes, I criticize government, but I think we should also say a couple of things about the opposition itself. How can we make opposition effective? How can we make it functional so that someone like Çavuşoğlu, top officials of the government, wouldn't feel that confident to do that kind of symbol when he sees Armenians. And I think he also thinks that these are disposable bodies. We already executed Armenians. I don't know the exact number. I think it's more than 1.5 million people. We already executed them. We already killed all of them, most of them. So almost nothing remained. And nobody could even come to us and ask for any kind of compensation. So there is no guilt for them. That's what they think. So that's why they are very confident when they come across with these kind of people. And I don't think that they have any fear. But one thing that I want to say, because I don't think that Armenians are actually victims in that picture. Of course, as long as the Armenian genocide is not officially recognized, people's wounds will continue to bleed, and they will, of course, feel frustrated, helpless. And I share, and I have huge sympathy for all these feelings. And most of the Kurds feel the same, believe me, especially those of us who witnessed some of the murders that happened in the 90s. So we all know what it means. You first get a threat message, and then the state finds a way to kill you. Sometimes they kill you through co-opting your relatives, co-opting your friends, so we all know how it works, and that's why we can of course be scared of all these negative developments. But one thing is, I think, because I need to feel empowered, and I want people also feel that kind of feeling that we are not helpless. So they did everything to kill all of us, most of us. They keep coming after us, even if we live abroad. They keep harassing us on social media or in some academic circles. They use all opportunities to take advantage of the situation. However, they also know that they will not be able to defend those crimes in the future. That day will come. Sooner or later, that day will come. So I'm going to stop here, but I would like to add a couple more points in the second round, okay?
This is great. So you're saying that the merging of the Islamist ideology and the ultranationalist far-right ideology as we see today between the AKP and MHP, especially in government, is what is feeling especially threatening. And Çavuşoğlu making the sign, of course, was a clear symbol of that. But you're saying that, you know, accountability should come, hopefully, at some day. And I mean, these are already, it started a little bit in Uruguay. These are all very good reasons why, you know, both of you mentioned the Uruguayan government actually had a very strong reaction to this hand gesture that happened. First, President Luis Lacalle Pou swiftly and publicly criticized the move and summoned the Turkish ambassador in protest. And then the Uruguayan Senate just the other week unanimously agreed to postpone the appointment of their ambassador to Turkey. So these were very strong reactions. I want to turn it to the United States here, because here we have a Biden administration which purports to follow a values-based foreign policy and to defend human rights across the world. So I want to ask you both, I'll start with Ohannes and then continue on to you, Dilan. What would you both like to see such a Biden administration? How should they respond to this scandalous move? And specifically, what would you, looking at the counterparts of Mr. Çavuşoğlu, what would you like to see from Secretary Blinken when he next meets with Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu? Ohannes, please.
I mean, the short answer is that basically I expect nothing. I will be surprised even if it becomes an issue. I mean, that gesture, that visit in Uruguay, as I think, or I guess that even it will not be an issue. Nobody will talk about it because there are so many hot and actual questions and problems in international arena that the Biden administration would not make the Armenian genocide a priority in its politics or as a determinant in its policy. It's obvious that they would not want to alienate Turkey, especially considering the situation in Caucasia and the relations with Russia. So unfortunately, it's a pity that the Armenian genocide, or more than 1 million people killed, wouldn't be an issue here to give direction to the policy. And because, by the way, although it's not our question today to discuss, but this pattern between the West, Turkey, and Russia, be it Soviet or not, is a very, very old pattern. Even I would say it has been there for 2 centuries almost. So in other words, as long as that pattern remains, and Russia remains, in other words, the West, and including the United States, wouldn't do anything to again, as I say, alienate Turkey or antagonize Turkey in this pattern, in this relation. And Çavuşoğlu and other Turkish politicians know this very well. They are aware of this very well. That's why they are so unconstrained about their attitude toward Armenian genocide and Armenians, okay? They know that the West or the United States would do nothing other than talking about this issue. Yeah, you said that Biden administration tries to follow a value-based foreign policy, but I think it's just a face value. When it comes to the hard questions, when it comes to the hard problems, realpolitik, whatever, they will continue to prioritize the interest of the United States. And as long as you prioritize your interest and as only your interest, it means that you will do nothing tangible about, nothing concrete about Armenian genocide. Because yes, your steps, your more concrete steps, your more tangible policies may alienate Turkey, and this may give harm to your interest. Yes, this may happen. But if you are sincere in your policy of human rights, whatever, you should consider, you should take this risk. Then it's very easy for anyone talking just, I say that I support human values here, there, and, but when human rights get conflictual with your interest, then it's important to take that steps, okay? Other than, it's very easy. And just let me remind Biden's statement about Armenian genocide last year, in other words, the first statement when he used the term genocide, so recognized it officially, let's say. If you consider the wording of that statement, you will see that Biden administration clearly tries to make a differentiation between the Ottoman Empire and contemporary Turkey in terms of responsibility of the Armenian genocide, okay? So in other words, they give an opportunity, they opened a door for Turkey to follow. But what Turkey did, or what the Turkish government did, they insistently continued to praise the genocide, or let's say deny the genocide, okay? They didn't use that door opened by Biden, okay? In other words, they did not put a gap or between themselves and the Ottoman Empire or the perpetrators, but they continued their attitude of denying and time to time, as we see in Çavuşoğlu's gesture, praising the genocide and perpetrator. Garopaylan's bill of law given to the Turkish Parliament, it was also an opportunity for Turkish Parliament to discuss this issue by itself, because whenever these resolutions, genocide resolutions, come to the agenda of other parliaments, they say that now this is not the work of other parliaments. What they say is not important, blah, blah, blah. But whenever the opportunity comes to discuss this issue in your own parliament, you don't have to recognize it. But even discussion about it just flares you up. Just you got angry and tried to lynch Garopaylan. Is this the right attitude? And he has been giving this proposal for last 7 years, but this year, as Dilan says, by the initiation of Meral Akşener, indeed, who came from grave of, let's say, tradition, now they are lynching Garopaylan. So what I'm trying to say is that as the United States or the Biden administration tries to make a differentiation between Turkey and genocide, Turkey, on the contrary, just get itself closer to the genocide. Emotionally, morally, ideologically. So again, I don't know, I may sound too pessimistic, but again, my guess is that this hard and actual political situations will overcome the genocide issue, and nobody, including Blinken, will make an issue, I think, unfortunately.
Well, you mentioned that they won't make an issue out of the genocide, but this is beyond that, right? It's beyond the issue of just the genocide. As we mentioned, this is a ongoing threat to. The Grey Wolves have been declared anti-Semitic by several Jewish groups. They continue to pose a massive threat, as Dilan explained some of the history in the 90s to the Kurds, to other minorities too. So it is a very much ongoing human rights issue. So an administration that claims to support human rights around the world should at least, would you like to see, at least Secretary of State of such an administration say something, at least when he meets with such a foreign minister?
Of course, I would like to see, but I don't think that they give any importance what I think, okay? That's the problem, or what other Armenians think, or whatever other minorities under threat think. Even if there is a threat to minorities or whatever, these marginalized people in Turkey, again, Biden administration, I guess, would do nothing other than talking, because taking these tangible steps against Turkey, in their eyes, would bring out high costs, okay? High costs for their foreign policy and for their interest. And they wouldn't do it. Basically, they don't care about this, okay? They just try to save the face value. And, just we recognize genocide, so if Armenians ask, we can say that, okay, we recognize genocide. What else? Okay. But when it comes to tangible political issues, I don't know. Would they take the risk? I mean, to put sanctions against Turkey because of the Armenian genocide or because of threats to minorities within Turkey? I don't think so. And I would say, unfortunately, this is the situation.
I'm very saddened to hear from you that a lot of people, I think, would agree with you and see that the U.S. interests don't seem to include human rights the way the Biden administration says that it should and that it does. Dilan, what do you think?
Yes, I share Ohannes' sentiments, but we know that the states also have sometimes conflicting, interests. Like, what do I mean by that? Yes, real politics override moral values when it comes to world politics. However, states also use various mechanisms in their interstate relationships. When we look at the Middle East, we see that US foreign policy maybe is not as strong as it should be, but especially when it comes to human rights violations and, targeting ethnic and religious minorities and all distant groups. However, we also see that they sometimes use some non-state actors, or they actually have shifting alliances, let's say. So I think we also have to remember this kind of, there is this kind of ambivalence when it comes to relations between states. And I think that it is that ambivalence, that's kind of space where minority groups or stateless groups can take advantage for their own sake. None of us could ever imagine that, or most of us could hardly imagine that US would support SDF, Kurds in Syria, and things would change for for the advantage of those groups in Syria. Yes, there is no maybe solid reason, like solid outcome, tangible outcome that would save those groups, because we still see that there are lots of states and non-state actors keep competing over the control of territory, and it's not going to end soon. However, US did it when they still had good relations with Turkey, or they were not ready to lose Turkey's support, because, as Ohannes said, there is Russia, there is Iran, and Turkey is more like a buffer zone for US, given the fact that they have their own military bases and intelligence, I think, stations and whatever we call it, in different parts of Turkey, especially close to the borders with Eurasia, with Russia, and with Iran. And we know Iran is one of the most expansionist actors in the Middle East. So part of me is not optimistic, because we know that interests, of course, would override values. However, again, there's the other side of me that doesn't accept that we are hopeless, okay? Because I believe that this kind of ambivalence when it comes to world politics still creates some sort of space for resistance What I would actually ask Blinken is, first, honestly, I'm going to ask I'm going to ask him a very personal question first. Are you happy that you are having this kind of meeting with Çavuşoğlu, who is himself a Turkish nationalist and who doesn't even stop himself from giving that kind of message in public that most of the religious and ethnic minorities find threatening? Second, if you support human rights, how do you reconcile this two? Third, I think US should know that, especially minorities in Turkey, yes, they have huge presence in Iraq, they have huge presence in Syria, and it's obvious that Iraq and Syria will stay as it is in the next 10 years as well, like in the next 10 years, maybe 15 and more. But the thing is that groups, minority groups, all these marginalized groups in Turkey shouldn't be sacrificed, because this is the direction actually that we are going towards right now. So it's obvious that violence is going to increase before election. There's a kind of trend in ethnically divided societies that, especially when the government is authoritarian, they use all these direct, non-direct tools to consolidate their power. So especially there is this kind of trend before and after elections that the violence increases. So it's going to happen in Turkey as well. And HDP is probably, it's hard to say, it's difficult to predict, but there's a kind of pattern, historical pattern, that they will probably close HDP. And even if HDP cannot have a solid political agenda in favor of minority groups at the moment, for various reasons, Kurds still continue to support HDP because it has this organic, ties with Kurdish political movement, and people have already sacrificed a lot. So it's the most Kurdish party still for Kurds, I think. So at the end of the day, if this is, these are the parameters that we have, when we look at the political space in Turkey, as a Kurdish scholar, I would actually ask Blinken if they can be a little more proactive in this political arena of Turkey, so that marginalized groups wouldn't feel more oppressed and excluded. And I think instead of having passive human rights position, we have to reconsider all the tools that we have in front of us, and we have to ask if alternative ways that would push the government to change its perception of ethnic and religious minorities.
Well, thank you so much. Any final remarks from Ohannes before I close this?
Maybe, US support to Kurdish group in Syria might be a good case to compare it with the Turkish-Armenian genocide. Yes, United States, Biden administration, let's say, supports the Kurdish groups there, but, true or wrong, or right or wrong, they have a calculation there, okay? They have, according to their plans or projects, they are pursuing the United States, interest of United States. They hope to have a leverage there through Kurds, etc. We can discuss this very long. But on the other hand,
ISIS, I have to add that neither.
Sure, exactly.
The biggest reason.
To weaken ISIS and etc. So, what I'm trying to say is that there is a political calculation there, and again the calculation of interest. But on the other hand, when you turn to the Armenian genocide, pushing Armenian genocide too far would bring nothing but headache for United States, for Biden administration. It's if I would say it's a totally moral obligation, okay, to push for it without any interest, without any profit, okay, without any leverage in the region or the international politics. This is why it's also a gauge to see if United States really follows human rights or prioritize human rights or values of human rights in its policy. Because in that issue, in the issue of Armenian genocide, you will win nothing, but all your policies, all your actions will be sake of morality, will be sake of human relations. Then, if you take the tangible steps in that issue, then I will be convinced that you prioritize human rights or whatever rights of minorities or all those things, rather than just talking about it. Without any profit, without any expectation of profit. Even if this case you push human rights policy, then you are credible. Otherwise, you are not.
You would certainly increase that credibility, and I think honestly it would have tangible results in that it could help, prevent the government from engaging in the kind of increased oppression and threats against minorities today in the lead up to the election, might even save some lives. So it would be a good policy to follow regardless. But this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today to discuss such an important topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your invitation.
Thank you, Merve.